Welcome to Tartarian Tales 21, and this one is going to be called The Submerged City. And this is a nice chapter with some good descriptions and great stuff, and it's going to pave the way for a new artwork that I'm going to do and another video heading your way called Worlds Under Mountains, where I took that allegory of life drawing from a previous video by Giorgio Gisi and I516 and redrew it in my own way with some more extra touches and some other cool things, and it will relate to this next video, but figured I'd connect Tartarian Tales with all the other interesting things that are going on and see what happens here. So, hope you enjoy this. It's time to read about Pinto and his journey to the submerged city. Let's see what happens here. And now to get back to my story, from which I strayed quite some time ago. After we departed from the twin cities of Pacau and Nachau, we proceeded on our way up the river, chained in the manner I described, until we reached another city called Mindo, not much larger than the last two, where half a league inland there was a very large saltwater lake with a huge number of solar evaporating ponds around it. The Chinese told us that the level of this lake rises and falls just like the ocean tides, despite the fact that it is located more than 200 leagues inland, and that it yielded the King of China an annual revenue of 100,000 taels just for his one-third share of the salt. Apart from this, the city also provided him with another 100,000 taels in revenue from its silk looms, camphor, sugar, porcelain, vermilion, and mercury, all of which they told us were produced here in enormous quantities. About 2 leagues beyond the city there were 12 rather long buildings that looked like warehouses, where large numbers of people were employed in the smelting and refining of copper plates, and they were making such an infernal racket with their hammers that if there is anything on earth resembling in hell, it had to be this. Curious about the cause of all this uncommon noise, we tried to find out from where it was coming and saw that in each of these buildings there were 40 furnaces blasting away, counting 20 on either side, with 40 huge anvils, on each of which 8 men were hammering away with rhythmic strokes at such a rapid pace that there was barely a time for our eyes to discern what their hands were doing. In each of these buildings they had 320 men working around the clock, which meant that in all 12 buildings there was a total workforce of 3,840, not counting the many other people assigned to various other jobs. When we asked how much copper was worked there annually, they said from 111,000 to 120,000 pickles, 2/3 of which went to the king, since the mine belonged to the crown, and that the mountain from which it was extracted was called Kortumbaga, which means river of copper, so named because ever since it was discovered, which was more than 200 years ago, the copper has never been exhausted. To the contrary, they kept on discovering more and more. Close by the river's edge, about a league beyond these warehouses, in the middle of a rather large landscaped area enclosed by 3 iron grillwork fences, we saw a group of 30 buildings standing in 5 rows, 6 in each row, which were also very long and well constructed, with bronze and cast iron bells hanging from tall towers, and a great deal of hand-carved workmanship, gilded columns, and hewn stone facades of very ingenious design. Here at this terraced area we went ashore with the permission of the Chifu, who took us there because of a vow he had made to visit this temple, which was called Bigay Potim, meaning the god of 110,000 gods. Korcho Fungani Gunako Gunaka, as they say, signifying bigger and stronger than all the others. For one of the perversities these wretched people blindly adhere to is the belief that each thing has its own particular god who created it, and who preserves for it its natural being, but that all of them are the offspring of this Bigay Potim, issuing from under his armpits, and that they receive their being from him, as from a father, by means of a filial union which they call Bijaro Petensehe. In the kingdom of Pegu, which I visited several times, I saw another pagoda similar to this one, which the natives call Gino Koginana, God of all greatness. It had been built by the Chinese in ancient times when they ruled over India, which was from AD 1013 to 1072, as would appear from their chronological account of events. From this chronology, one can see that the Chinese rule lasted only 59 years, because the successor of the king who conquered India, called Oksivagao, renounced it voluntarily when he realized how high a price he was paying in the blood of his people and how little he was getting in return. In the 30 buildings mentioned above, there was a huge quantity of gilded wooden idols, and as many more made of tin, copper, brass, cast iron, and porcelain. Such a huge quantity that I would not dare hazard a guess at the number. From here, we could not have gone more than 6 or 7 leagues further when we saw a large city that appeared to extend for more than a league around, with its walls and buildings completely demolished. When we asked the Chinese why everything was in ruins, they told us that this city had formerly been called Kohi Lauza, meaning wildflower, and that it had been very prosperous in its day, and that about 142 years ago a foreigner had come there in the company of some merchants from the Siamese port of Tenasserim, and that apparently from what was written about him in a book entitled Taxaphalam, he was a holy man, in spite of the fact that the Bonzes called him a sorcerer at that time because of the wondrous deeds he performed. For in less than a month he had raised up 5 persons from the dead, and had wrought many other marvels that amazed everyone. And on several occasions, when the priests had engaged him in theological disputations, he confounded them and put them all to shame, so that in order to avoid getting into any more arguments with him, they incited all the people against him by getting them to believe that if they failed to kill him, God would punish them by sending down fire from heaven. As a result, inflamed by their words, the mob converged on the house of a poor weaver named Joanne, where the foreigner lodged, killing the weaver, 2 of his sons-in-law, and a son for trying to defend him. Then the holy man appeared before them in tears, and rebuked them for their mob action, arising out of their evil way of life. One of the things, among others, that he said when he spoke to them at the time was that the God in whose faith they would find salvation was called Jesus Christ, and that he had come down to earth from heaven to become a man of flesh and blood, and that it had been necessary for him to die for the sake of mankind, and that with the price of his blood, which he shed upon the cross for all sinners, God in his justice was so thoroughly satisfied that he gave him the power of heaven and earth, and promised him that all who profess his law with good faith and good works would not be denied their due reward, and that all the gods that the Bonzes worshipped and served with ritual blood sacrifices were false, and idols in which the devil hid to deceive them. Upon hearing these words, the priests became so enraged that they began to shout, bringing down curses on any and all who refused to help gather firewood with which to burn him at the stake. This was soon done, with great haste, and as the fire began to spread with tremendous fury, he made the sign of the cross over it, and uttered a few words which they could not remember, but which were also recorded, and the fire went out immediately. Amazed by such a wondrous thing, all the people began to shout, "This man's God must be extremely powerful, and most worthy of being worshipped throughout all the world." When he heard this, and saw that the people were beginning to draw back because of what they had seen, one of the Bonzes, who had been the main instigator of the mob, threw a stone at the holy man, shouting as he did so, "Whoever fails to do as I am doing, may the serpent of the night swallow him in his fiery jaws." At these words, all the other Bonzes followed suit, so that right there they succeeded in stoning him to death. And after they had thrown his body into the river, the current checked its flow to such an extent that, during the 5 days that the holy corpse remained in the river, it never followed its course downstream. And after witnessing that wondrous deed, many people became followers of that man's religion, and there were still a large number of them living around there. Just as the Chinese were telling us this, we rounded a bend in the river and saw a small terraced area completely surrounded by trees, in the middle of which there was an extremely large and well-fashioned stone cross, the sight of which affected us so that I can honestly say, in all truth, that there are no words to describe the feeling that the Lord our God instilled in us there. We begged the Chifu on our knees to let us go ashore to see for ourselves what those men had been talking about, but that heathen dog put us off with the excuse that we still had a long way to go to the next town where we were to spend the night, and his refusal left us feeling quite disconsolate. But since the Lord our God, in his mercy, would grant us this blessing almost miraculously, he ordained that when he had already gone more than a league further, by dint of straining against the oars with the greatest difficulty, at that very moment his pregnant wife, who was on board with him, began to get such severe labor pains that he was forced to turn back and put into the place we had left behind, which was a village of 30 or 40 hearths called Zifengguai, next to where the cross was located. Disembarking there, he took a house for his wife, where she died in childbirth 9 days later. In the meantime, we all went down to the place where the cross stood, and there, prostrated on the ground, with the tears running down our cheeks, we paid a due reverence, to the open amazement of the townspeople, who all came running up to us. They too got down on their knees, and raising their arms heavenward, they also kissed the cross over and over as they chanted these words: Christo Jesu Christo, Maria Mikara Vida late imponi mudel, which in our language means Christ Jesus, Jesus Christ, Mary, ever a virgin, conceived him, a virgin bore him, and a virgin remained. To which we replied, weeping, that indeed it was so. When they asked if we were Christians, we said yes, which they were delighted to hear, and they took us to their homes and gave us shelter and treated us with loving kindness, for these people were all Christians who descended from the weaver in whose house the holy man had lived. Then we asked them if the story told us by the Chinese was true, and they related how the whole thing had come about and showed us a book that had been printed on the subject, dealing with some very wondrous things that had been wrought there by the Lord through that holy man whose name it said was Mateus Escandel, and that he had been a hermit on Mount Sinai, and it said that he was a Hungarian from a town called Buda. And in the same book, it says that 9 days after that holy man had been laid to rest, in the same town where he still lay buried, an earthquake struck the city of Koh-Hilauza, where he had been slain, with such a sharp jolt that all the common people fled in terror to the open fields, settling in tents, for none of them dared to go back to their homes. At this time the bonzes came running up in an effort to calm the crowds of people that were milling about, because they were all shouting at the same time, "The blood of the holy foreigner will demand vengeance for his death at the hands of our bonzes, for he was telling the truth." They reprimanded the people for what they were saying, telling them not to talk that way because it was a grave sin, and that they should not be afraid, for they promised that they would all ask Quie Tuigrarem, the god of night, to command the earth not to do that again, otherwise they would withhold their alms from him. With that, all the priests formed a procession and marched off to the temple of this idol, the most important one in their religion, but they went all by themselves, because the people were too afraid of returning to the city to accompany them. And they say that the night after this earthquake, shortly before 11 o'clock, while all these ministers of the devil were in the midst of offering their sacrifices, with the burning of fragrant incense and other ceremonies they usually perform, the Lord our God in his divine justice ordained a righteous punishment for them by permitting the earth to tremble again, but this time with such tremendous force that temples, houses, walls, and every other kind of building in the city collapsed, bringing death to all the bonzes, without a single one of them escaping alive. And according to what the book says, there were more than 4,000 of them. Then the earth opened up, and water gushed out from beneath the surface, submerging the entire city, and leaving in its wake a large lagoon more than 100 fathoms deep. They also told us many other things that were utterly amazing. And from that time on, the city was called Fayunganors, meaning punishment from heaven, though it had previously been known as Koh-Hilauza, which I have already said means wildflower. So wow, this tells some incredible stuff. And it's got a lot of Christianity, but it's also got a lot of the mystery and different things, like the copper farms. It seems like there was, finding a river of copper and being able to make so much money and so much success and warehouses off of it means that copper was pretty prominent then, and I'm sure they used it for a lot of things. Like we all kind of summarize that they use it in the ether technologies, they use it in, making idols, making everything, weapons maybe, but probably a lot more, probably something really amazing that they used. And these copper mountains were probably, if they just kept coming, they said it never exhausted its supply. And so I wonder where it is. It's also very interesting where the city submerged, and how a city like this, from what the story goes, was taken by like a holy karmic act of some sort. Was that person divine? Was that a true story? I don't really know. But the fact that it seemed like, people in towns and stuff cities can be buried by natural occurrences that can kind of come out of nowhere. You never really know if it's an earthquake or something under. Maybe it's even beings underground that didn't like it. Who knows? There really could be anything to this story. But the way they keep it going, it sounds very interesting. A submerged city. Imagine how many cities are submerged under sand, under water, under forests, under mountains, under everything. There's got to be so many things where the stories have just been gone. Nature's just covered it up, and there's so many things that we all are missing. So many things we're not seeing because nature and time has covered it up. There must be so many of these places all over the world, and maybe the interior, who knows? what is going on in here? Are we in one of these? Does it just keep going and we constantly keep going up and we just dig ourselves out of more and more firmament holes and caverns and mountains? What is going on in this world? I hope we figure it out. But hearing these stories adds a little tiny bit of insight every time, and I'm hoping you all are liking them, because copper was a very interesting thing of the past, the Great Lakes and beyond. Our ancients loved copper. Wonder why. Bless you all.